Hi, I'm Noah Gervais, and if you're like me, you own an incredibly shitty car. A one-paycheck car. The kind of $500 shit heap you only buy out of absolute necessity. The catch-22 with a one-paycheck car, though, is that you have to rely on it immediately, and a car that cheap literally always has some series of ways that it's going to shit. This amateur guide will show you some simple diagnostic, repair, and tune-up procedures for older vehicles that'll allow you to more clearly assess how beat up your junker really is, and get you down the road for a couple more paychecks at minimum cost to you. Always refer to your own car's repair manual for specific procedures, as they can differ widely from what you see in this video. Most of the general advice, though, is universal to the kind of car that you can buy for $500. The simplest thing you can do is check the oil. You'll find a prominent tube with a ring coming out of it in your engine compartment. This is the dipstick. When the engine's cold and with the car off, wipe off the dipstick and reinsert it into the tube. When you pull it out again, there will be guidelines on the stick that indicate a minimum and maximum oil level. You're aiming for the full line. Your owner's manual will have your engine's oil capacity listed. Always fill with that exact amount of oil, maybe a little less, never any more. While you're checking the dipstick, note how the oil looks. If it's black or a dark brown and gritty, you'll need to change the oil and filter, which is about $40 and pretty easy to do. If it's an opaque chocolate color like a milkshake, you have antifreeze in your oil due to a blown head gasket, which is very bad. Before you buy a $500 car, always check the oil, both for the level of oil and the consistency of the oil. To drain your oil, you just have to undo a bolt on the bottom of your engine block, or 2 bolts in this car's case. I'm really serious about always reading your own car's manual for specifics. But however many bolts you have, you'll find them right on the bottom of your engine. Wait at least a couple hours after driving to change your oil. The oil stays hot for a long time. Undo the bolts, don't let them fall in the oil, and then wait for all of the oil to drip out. That usually takes about 20 minutes. Then unscrew the oil filter. It's a big round fella, usually on the front of the engine, and it's meant to be screwed and unscrewed by hand. If it's stuck, you need a kinda strap wrench to get it loose. It also helps if you wash all the engine grease off your hands before you try to unscrew it. You'll have better grip that way. Screw in and hand tighten the new filter, which costs about $4 to $8 a pop, and then put the bolts back into the bottom of your engine. Then fill your capacity of oil from the top. There will be a little tube up there to do it from. For worn engines with leaks and drips, you can add an oil stabilizer like Lucas cells. The idea is it thickens the oil's viscosity so it doesn't flow through the cracks in your gasket so easy. I found stabilizers to result in small but noticeable improvements in oil drips and burn-off. It's a little expensive, so you can always just keep dumping more oil into your junker if that's your price preference, but I like the stabilizers. For what sort of oil you put in your car, like 520 or 1040 or what have you, just refer to your owner's manual. Engines differ, and sometimes they can be incredibly specific about what kind of oil they want. While you're checking the oil, you should also check the power steering fluid dipstick. If you're hearing angry noises when you steer, you're out of power steering fluid. Like the oil dipstick, but way shorter, it will tell you on the stick what fluid level is appropriate. Both oil and power steering fluid should be checked when the engine is cold, but for the transmission fluid, you have to do it while the engine is hot and running. After you've already driven for a bit is best. The dipstick is always at the rear of your engine compartment, usually in a thicker tube than the oil dipstick. Your transmission fluid should be a bright red or pink color. If it's brown, you have badly worn fluid and should have it changed immediately. Automatic transmissions are incredibly complicated and twitchy. Be careful flushing them yourself. You have to know what you're doing or you're going to damage something. If you have a manual transmission, your gearbox uses oil instead of the red or pink fluid. Finally, if there are metal shavings in the fluid, your transmission is about to die, and you should plan for that. If you're adding more transmission fluid, you just do it through the dipstick tube. Usually, unless your manual says otherwise. Another thing to check when you buy a $500 car is the radiator condition and how the fluid looks in there. It'll tell you a lot. I didn't check the coolant when I got this Mercury, and it overheated coming back from taking my girlfriend to work. After letting it cool off, I took off the cap and discovered that the coolant was orange, opaque, and gritty. My radiator was full of rust. So I flushed the radiator, which is pretty easy. You just disconnect the hose from the bottom of the radiator, the big hose, let the coolant pour into a bucket, make sure you do not get any in your eyes, then you reattach the hose, refill the radiator with water, run the car for a few minutes, wait for it to cool, pull the bottom hose out again and drain, then reattach the hose and fill again with water, and repeat a couple more times. On your final refill of the radiator, you can use real antifreeze instead of water, but there's no reason to keep using expensive coolant if you're just going to be flushing out rust and other particulates. Here's the kicker. Even when the rust was gone, the water was turning brown and foaming. The only way this happens is if you have a head gasket failure. I mentioned earlier that this is bad. It's pretty much the most expensive single repair that there is outside of transmission failure, because the head gasket is the thing that attaches the top and bottom halves of the engine, with little channels in between allowing coolant to flow. Over time, the extreme heat and pressure of the engine will break down these passages, allowing coolant, exhaust, and oil to mix freely and foul all the mixing systems. Another quick and dirty way to diagnose a head gasket failure is to run your finger around the inside of your exhaust pipe after the car's been running. If there's a lot of condensation, you're burning coolant in the combustion chamber, and it's only through head gasket failure that you can get coolant in the exhaust like that. Head gasket failure makes you much more likely to overheat, since your coolant is full of hot oil and your hot oil is full of coolant, but the act of overheating warps your head gasket further, making the problem worse. Head gasket failure is bad news, and doing the head gasket yourself is an expert repair that takes several days. Paying someone else to do it is never less than $1,000. I chose a third option, chemical voodoo. There are products on the market called head gasket sealant that you can dump into your radiator, and then it circulates through the passages and coagulates where there's a temperature differential, like where it's leaking. Head gasket in a can will not work if your gasket is too blown out. I didn't have coolant in my oil yet, only exhaust and oil in my coolant, and I could still drive on the freeway without immediately overheating, so my head gasket was not that far gone yet. Rule of thumb is, if your car cannot idle for at least half an hour, you need more than head gasket in a can. The most common is a product called Blue Devil, but the process for baking that stuff into your gasket is complicated and takes more than 24 hours. I chose a cheaper, faster product, still highly rated on Amazon, called Bars Leaks. I've been driving for 2 weeks with it flowing through the coolant, and my coolant is still the color of clear yellow antifreeze. No oil, no exhaust, and the exhaust pipe is bone dry. Eventually, the head gasket will continue to disintegrate, and it will be a lot worse that time around. But for now, I solved a potentially fatal car problem that costs hundreds or thousands of dollars to fix for $60, and it took about 2 hours. This stuff will also plug up your heater core, and there are a lot of very valid arguments for why you should not use head gasket in a can. But head gasket in a can saved my bacon with a $500 car, and I would recommend it for warding off the junkyard for a few extra months if you really need it in a pinch. Your $500 car might have been taken care of well for a time, but that time might have been during the Clinton presidency, so you really ought to check your spark plugs while you're at it. Spark plugs are a cheap but critical part of your car. All the parts listed in this section of the video will run you about $75, $20 for plugs, $25 for plug wires, and $30 for a distributor cap and rotor. All of this stuff is for making sure that the electricity that enters your combustion chamber is enough to ignite all the gasoline that's in there and give you a powerful engine stroke. On the spark plug, the electricity jumps from the little button under the hook to the hook, a literal bolt of lightning in a bottle that makes the explosion that makes your car go. A lot of that has to do with the gap, how far the spark has to jump to get from the little button to the hook. Your car has a specific distance, the spark gap, that you need to set all your plugs to before going in. This is critical. It has to be a consistent gap, and it has to be the gap that your engine is designed for. In my case, it's 0.05 inches. You can use either a loop gapper or coin gapper, but the loop gappers have a handy little adjuster tool on them. When I pulled out the old plugs on this car, the gap had worn down to 0.07 inches, up from 0.05 on almost all 8 plugs. Now, the spark needs twice as much energy to jump that distance, or else it'll spark weakly. When your spark is too weak to ignite the gas fully, this causes a misfire, which you can identify by bad rhythm in the engine and a big loss of power. For the gap to be as wide as that, my spark plugs would have to have been left in for years and years without being changed. But plugs can also foul from excessive carbon deposits, which build up over the metal surface of the hook and interfere with the spark plug's ability to land the jump over the gap. You don't have to do all your plugs at once, but they're not very expensive, and consistency in your ignition system is a worthwhile thing. Next, replace the wires. It's not always necessary to replace the wires, but if the boots have stuck to the end of the plugs, they can easily rip when you're trying to remove them. If you plan on replacing the wires from the start, you save yourself a lot of yelling and cursing when the boot tears on your last plug. The wires don't all connect to the distributor in a straightforward pattern, though. Do your wires one at a time so you can be absolutely certain that you're plugging them in the correct firing order. The correct firing order can also be found in your repair manual. Now the cap. In some cars, you have to get really fancy with a distributor to replace the rotor, and in some, you don't. The easiest way to tell, besides reading your repair manual thoroughly, is to look for an anchor slot. If your rotor hooks in so that it only goes back on the direction that you took it out, you're golden. If you can place the rotor back in any direction, you're in for a much more complicated repair, which I'll talk about some other time. My 73 bus is this way and requires the engine to be cranked so that cylinder number 1 is at top dead center before beginning a rotor replacement. Modern caps and rotors are usually a little more forgiving, but make sure to unhook the center wire first, that's the power wire, and then replace the wires from the old cap onto the new one at a time to make sure that the firing order is correct. I like to do it one side of the engine at a time as well. It seems easier that way somehow. All these components will give you a stronger ignition, and if they've been neglected, you'll really notice the power difference after you do this job. This is also a good time to check your air filter. Its location varies widely from car to car, but it'll always be prominently located somewhere up top. It's easy to forget, but if your air filter isn't mostly clean, your car might have trouble sucking in all the oxygen it needs for combustion. Rule of thumb, if it looks like you'd have a hard time breathing through your air filter, so would your car. If you got burnout bulbs, don't be alarmed. They're cheap and easy to replace. It might not be immediately obvious, but you can peel back the lining of your trunk and expose the light sockets within minutes. Then, in a lot of cars, you can just twist and pull the socket from the back of the taillight and replace the bulb that way. If your repair manual won't tell you what bulbs you need, which would be a surprise, Google will. Bulbs are expected to go out, so they make it nice and easy on you to replace them in most circumstances. Also, check all the fuses in your fuse box. Some might be burnt through, some might be missing. Fuses are electrical safety components that burn out and sever an electrical connection if there's enough resistance in the circuit. 10 amps, 15 amps, 20 amps, so on. Refer to your manual for what your fuse box is supposed to look like, then start making reality conform to that diagram. A fuse is burnt out if the little strip of metal between the two prongs of the fuse is broken in any way. That means the connection is severed. You can always push your $500 car to the limit and have as much fun as possible in it, but you'll have less time with it. If you have a shitty car for necessity and not for fun, the way you drive the car can really impact how soon it will die. Hard acceleration is the enemy. You don't want either high revs or high pressure. The key element to grandfathering a car along is patience. Find wear in the accelerator, usually at 1/4 to 1/3 throttle, that you can start getting a good amount of torque and power, and then let it ride right there in the middle of your engine's comfort zone. You could ask for more power, the car might give it, but you should save that for when you really need it, like a passing situation. Allow yourself to go a little below the speed limit on big hills. Follow the semi-trucks going 55. Ultimately, the car will tell you when it's under stress by being loud and ornery and inconsistent. Keep that level of stress to an absolute minimum. Using the air conditioner puts a deceptively massive amount of extra strain on the engine. Dress light and use the vent. Just make sure you don't use the AC compressor if you want your engine to be running smooth. If you like, you can even pull the fuse for the compressor, or the belt for the compressor if you are 100% sure that that's the only thing that belt powers. There's a temptation, anytime you have a $500 car, to say, fuck it, whatever. But you're dealing with a vehicle at the outer limits of its operational life. Tell your cheap-ass car, fuck it, and it will oblige with a startling quickness. Craft and necessity are the great majority of the single-paycheck car ownership experience, but the rest is pure faith. I'm not a religious man, I don't believe in God, but automotive maintenance is essentially a meditative and devotional act. You offer the blood of your knuckles, the sweat of your brow, the money in your pockets, and an expectation that your vehicle will remain faithful and animate for just a little while longer. It's not necessary to add a spiritual component to your repairs. The Chiltons will do you fine, but I think you'll find that owning a $500 car is more rewarding if you allow a little mysticism into it as well. Thanks for watching. Do is check the oil. You'll find a prominent tube with a ring coming out of it in your engine compartment. This is the dipstick. When the engine's cold and with the car off, wipe off the dipstick and reinsert it into the tube. When you pull it out again, there'll be guidelines on the stick that indicate a minimum and maximum oil level. You're aiming for the full line. Your owner's manual will have your engine's oil capacity listed. Hi, I'm Noah Gervais, and if you're like me, you own an incredibly shitty car. A one-paycheck car. The kind of $500 Clunker really is, and get you down the road for a couple more paychecks at minimum cost to you. Always refer to your own car's repair manual for specific procedures, as they can differ widely from what you see in this video. Most of the general advice, though, is universal to the kind of car that you can buy for $500. The simplest thing you can do is a shit heap you only buy out of absolute necessity. The catch-22 with a one-paycheck car, though, is that you have to rely on it immediately, and a car that cheap literally always has some series of ways that it's going to shit. This amateur guide will show you some simple diagnostic repair and tune-up procedures for older vehicles that allow you to more clearly assess how beat up you're did. Always fill with that exact amount of oil, maybe a little less, never any more. While you're checking the dipstick, note how the oil looks. If it's black or a dark brown and gritty, you'll need to change the oil and filter, which is about $40 and pretty easy to do. If it's an opaque chocolate color like a milkshake, you have antifreeze in your oil due to a blown head gasket.